Okay, let's get started. So welcome everyone to Restaging Sex and the Social. New books from Fordham University Press, Christopher Brew and Karen Wachter-Green in conversation with Anne Pellegrini and Avgi Sakatopoulou. My name is Greg Newton. I'm the co-founder, along with my partner, Donnie Jokum, of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. I just realized, cut my head off. My cameraman. Donnie and I founded the Bureau almost 12 years ago. It's November 15th is the Bureau's birthday. It's a Scorpio like me. And we have been here at the LGBT Community Center since 2014. So we're an all-volunteer independent queer bookstore. We are dependent on sales and donations to keep this baby going. So I'm going to pass around a bag for donations, but basically we strongly encourage you to make a donation, especially if you know you won't be buying any books. But if you will be buying books and you want to make a donation, you are thoroughly welcome to do so. So I'll pass that around. There's some change in the bag. There's also a QR code on the back if you want to give on Venmo. And for those of you online, if you'd like to make a donation on Venmo, you can do so at BGSQD. If you're not already on our email list and you would like to be, you can sign up for that at the back of the room or on our website, bgsqd.com, and you'll get a newsletter every other Monday about our upcoming events, which we have many of. And we can all use plenty of distractions these days, so we'll do our best to continue providing them. Before I introduce Chris and Karen, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement and a statement of solidarity with the people of Palestine. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-Native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. We also recognize Palestinian liberation as a queer issue. As queer people, we know the pain of being cast out. We have been and continue to be despised by many, even by our own parents, families, and communities of origin. This reality evokes in many of us a deep empathy with others who are likewise seen not as fully human, but as problems to be solved, questions for which the answer is ultimately elimination and erasure. As we watch the ongoing genocide of Palestinians by the State of Israel, carried out with the full support of our government and funded by our tax dollars, we witness the inevitable results of defining a people solely as a threat to the safety and well-being of those deemed inherently worthy of life. This horror compels us to speak out not only against the current bombardment and siege of Gaza by the State of Israel, but against the historical and ongoing violent displacement of Palestinians by Zionists and the conditions of occupation and apartheid under which Palestinians have been forced to live for over 75 years. In our longing for a very different reality, we take inspiration from the words of Jose Esteban Munoz. Queerness is essentially about the rejection of a here and now and an insistence on potentiality or concrete possibility for another world. And that is from Munoz's Cruising Utopia, a book which we are happy to sell to you if you are interested. So, Christopher Brew is professor of English at Illinois State University, where he teaches classes in contemporary literature and culture, critical and cultural theory, and gender and sexuality. In addition to the featured book tonight, In Defense of Sex, Non-Binary Embodiment and Desire, He is the author of Hard-Boiled Masculinities, Insistence of the Material, Literature in the Age of Biopolitics, co-editor of Noir Affect. He is also the author of multiple articles theorizing intersex and his own history of medicalized embodiment. Karen Wachter-Green is assistant professor of liberal arts at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she teaches classes on African American and multi-ethnic American literatures, Black feminism, gender and sexuality studies, and queer history. Tonight, she will be presenting from her forthcoming book with Fordham University Press, Black Kenosis, The Erotic Undoing of African American Literature. Please welcome Karen and Chris.
Wonderful to see everybody here. Yeah, okay, I'm good on the live stream, I think. So yeah, my head's maybe a little cut off. If I sit down, I'll be fine. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Greg, for that beautiful introduction and for the words, the really powerful words you said about what's going on in Gaza right now and the genocide that's ongoing. You know, this is such a strange day to be doing this right now. You know, what took place yesterday feels like the negation of all of what we believe in, you know, and the kind of collective work that's done in spaces like this, and the kind of collective recognition and affirmation of important forms of embodiment, important forms of identification, important forms of community. And so it feels really rich and affirming to be here tonight, to be here talking about this stuff with you, because you know, my book is trying to be, you know, is trying to imagine, like you know, Jose, I mean, I'm you know, influenced by Jose Munoz, and I, you know, my book is trying to imagine a better world, in, you know, a world in which sex can be rich, kinky, but also a relationship to otherness and a sense of affirmation, that sex is also part of the ways in which we build the world, that it's a world building project. So with that in mind, I want to read from the preface from In Defense of Sex. I've never actually read this part of this. I've presented this work a decent amount, but I've never read this part of it. Before I do that though, we actually have, I'm going to see if we have time. We probably have time to play the song. I talked about a song, so let me see if I can. Oh, you know what? I don't know if we're going to be able to do it with the live. Can we pull up a song, or is it going to be complicated?
Well, I'm afraid that YouTube will kick us off.
Oh, it's okay. Don't worry about it. I'll just.
Material.
Okay. If any of you are that's all right. It's all right. If any of you are Yves Tumor fans, it's about Yves Tumor's Gospel for a New Century. But anyway, I will get to that in a second. I just want to sort of describe the shape of the book, and then I will read from the preface. This book is arguing for, it's called In Defense of Sex, and it's arguing for sex in two different registers. And it's interesting because, you know, right now, because of the ways in which sex is getting invoked in transphobic discourses, and the ways in which forms of asexuality and asexual theory have critiqued the sort of what am I trying to say? The ways in which there's a sex is made into a you know, compulsory sexuality. Sex actually has become a kind of almost not a bad word, but a word that actually is freighted in certain ways. And so I wanted to argue, though, that we actually still need the concept of sex, and we need it on a couple different levels. One of them is in terms of embodiment, and as somebody who was born with an intersex condition and had all kinds of unnecessary surgeries that are surgeries that became necessary because of the original unnecessary surgery I had. It feels really important for me to think about sex still, even as I also want to do it in a way that also affirms all the rich work done around gender and non-binary thinking is about gender within trans theory and trans culture, that we need sex in the 21st century, but we need a very different version of sex than we've had in the 20th and earlier centuries, where it was primarily binary. And so I wanted to argue, if we really want to think about intersex and trans folks, and I think we need this, and we need this in terms of queer folk in general, if we want to think of an alliance there, which a lot of people have called for, including people like Pigeon Pagonis and other intersex activists, then we really need to think about how these can be theorized together. And if we erase sex, then we erase really the difference that intersex is on a certain level. So so that's the first part. The other part was I grew up in or I didn't grow up, I spent my 20s in San Francisco and Santa Cruz in the kind of pro-sex culture of the West Coast. And I've watched that vision, which was so important to me, especially as somebody who was raised by parents who were wonderful, but rather sexually uptight, and grew up in Chicago, which was a great place to grow up. But there was a way in which the idea of pro-sex culture felt like a liberation to me, and it was really important. And I've seen that vision erode in the present, and first slowly and now very quickly. And I think if we are going to imagine non-fascist ways forward, queer ways forward, then we're going to have to reimagine sex as desire in an affirmative register, and not just the ways in which we think about it, and increasingly in paranoid logics or logics of harm. As I don't want to erase harm either, but it shouldn't be the master trope for how we think about sex. Okay. And then the book starts out talking about that. It argues for those two ideas around sex. It then talks about how gender replaced sex, or it was the gender sort of was ascendant and sex went into decline from the 16th century up through the present, and mostly focusing on the 19th and 20th centuries. And then it theorizes sex in a psychoanalytic register. It also draws from Black studies to think about flesh, and flesh is also something that's a mediating form of embodiment in relationship to both gender and sex, and one that is historically freighted in various ways. And I'll talk about that more. And then it talks about the ways in which it talks about the history of medicalization of bodies, and the ways in which medicalizations of bodies both are utopian, but there's also dystopian forms of violence attaching to it, from the violence against Black slave women done by Marion Sims, who was the quote unquote father of gynecology, horrible surgeries without anesthetic. And then also in a very different register, and obviously with more privilege to the intersex folks, but also done to intersex folk in the 40s and 50s and 60s, including me, as a kind of mode of accumulation by dispossession of forms of medical knowledge. And so I talk about that medicine is both utopian and dystopian at the same time. And we need to rethink medicine in a more utopian register and in a more consensual register, among other things. And then the book ends with imagining a sexual and embodied commons, and what that might look like, and what a form of public sexual culture and embodied culture that is affirmative and that is run by everyday people, and that also has state support, because we need states to support what we do. But spaces like this would be one example of such a sexual and embodied commons. So anyway. After talking about that, let me read from the preface here, and then I will turn it over to Karen. So. Okay, the preface is, "This ain't by design, girl." The needle drops on the opening cut of the non-binary artist Yves Tumor's brilliant 2020 album, Heaven to a Tortured Mind. Gospel for a New Century begins with a slinky rhythmic loop that finishes with a horn flourish, sampled from a marching band. Absolute silence appears out of nowhere for a beat. The silence here is not the typical absence of sound that you encounter in recording, where you may still hear certain sounds, such as the whisper of guitar strings or the breathing of various band members. And while I prefer my music on vinyl, like any typical 21st century hipster, the best way to really appreciate the silence is on streaming or via CD and on headphones. The silence is absolute. Paradoxically, it takes on a forceful presence in the absolute absence it conveys. Like the silence in Prince's Kiss, the silence in Gospel for a New Century becomes an active structuring element in the song. The allusion to kisses here is not arbitrary. The purple one is an artist to whom Yves Tumor is clearly indebted. From the tensions between rock and soul, the sacred and the profane, and the carnal and the spiritual in their music, to the complex, joyful, but also obsessive gender and sexual play that organizes both music and words. Both artists, despite Prince's later homophobic renouncements of his earlier sexually explicit music, produce music that is queer in the most forceful sense of the word. Prince always spoke to me that way. He was really he and Bowie were really important sites of identification for me. Gender, sex, and sexuality and embodiment, including the signifiers of race, are remixed and radically restructured in sound. The restructurization is deeply sexy. This is not queerness as monstrous threat, but as joyfully freakish embodiment and desire. In what follows in this book, I hope this vision of joyful freakishness persists as an erotic beacon, indexing what is possible to build and sustain when a collective sense of queerness's solidarity, desire, and embodiment is produced. Even as we also recognize that our minds have been tortured by class inequality, transphobia, homophobia, racism, misogyny, and ableism. The song is freakish in the best sense of the word. It invites you to freak your desire, your embodiment, and the larger society in which you live. If Funkadelic invited us to free your mind and your ass will follow, Yves Tumor presents the opposite yet complementary injunction. Through material instantiations of, their music feels like it is about freeing your ass so that your mind may follow. Through material instantiations of queer embodiments, our minds can become free of binary genders, sexes, and conceptions of desire, and begin to imagine anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and queer forms of solidarity. Of course, the mind-ass dialectic works both ways. This book will attempt to free our minds so our asses will follow, but it's important to realize that both are necessary. Freak your mind, freak your ass. You have nothing to lose but capitalism, normativity, and your tightly scripted egoic identity. Let us return to the silence which recurs throughout the song. It functions as an active negativity, existing in tension with the looped rhythm and brass. This forceful negativity, the active presence elsewhere of something that is neither visible nor present for immediate apprehension, is central to the logic of sex articulated, indeed defended in this book. Sex as a dimension of both embodied desire, embodiment and desire, is in a negative relationship to the ways in which gender and our egoic identification structure our active relationship to and appearance as gendered and sexual beings. It is a structuring absence. While absence often implies a presence on another scene, the presence of sex elsewhere is both elusive and plural. Moreover, while it has material instantiations, sex is anything but the rigidly binary site of material truth that normative and transphobic discourses make of it in imposing it to gender. As Paisley Curra and Dean Spade have differently documented, such discourses and their instantiation in law have often formed the leading edges of transphobic and reactionary movements and practices around sex and gender. And unfortunately, I worry that those are very much on the march again. I mean, they have been, and I worry it's going to get worse. Sex in its various invocations is hardly an innocent category. And one can understand why, progressive transpositive work may choose to focus on gender rather than sex. Yet this book argues that sex can be conceptualized otherwise. Indeed, if we want to theorize intersex and trans together, we need a different conception of sex. If we want to theorize how social and erotic desire functions within social spaces, we need a different conception of sex. In Defense of Sex argues for an understanding of sex as non-binary and material, thus having a positive dimension, and yet also as structured by a fundamental negativity, resistant to any attempt at positivization. It is, as I argue in chapter 2, extimate. Lacan's neologism designates both what is an intimate exteriority and an exteriorized intimacy. Sex is precisely such a thing. It is elsewhere, in negative tension with the visible, yet experienced as an intimate alienness, the otherness within, and the dimensions of ourselves that we experience, and as intersecting with the external world, that works to structure our relationship to both embodiment and desire. Drawing on work in feminist new materialism, I theorize sex as material and transcorporeal in Stacey Alimo's sense. Yet this understanding should be put into productive tension with the Lacanian account I have also just articulated, such that there is a not all to sex. It cannot be fully positivized. This understanding of sex in the pages that follow is also articulated in relationship to recent work in the theories of race and racialization that takes the flesh as a crucial category, one distinct from both gender and sex, in which forms racialized and economic meaning, violence, and connection, in which forms of racialized and economic meaning, violence, and connection are inscribed and lived in the flesh. Finally, the understanding of sex articulated in this book is historicized within a larger Marxist framework. Desire and embodiment are historically shaped and transformed. They may become second nature at times, and psychoanalysis is one of the technologies we use to plumb this second nature, but they are still finally shaped and reshaped by historical and political economic dynamics, however long and however seemingly fixed. In a more political dimension, I also draw on Marxism to theorize the forms of solidarity and collective struggle that transcend the increasingly individualized and atomized structures of identity formation and recent accounts of gender and sexuality in relationship to liberal and leftist political discourse in the United States more generally. God, it didn't feel hot till I got up there. All right. To return to A Gospel for a New Century, the song's racial resonances accrue around the reworking of the sample of the marching band. The sample does not merely repeat, even as the rhythm track recurs. Instead, after repeating 3 times, the repetition becomes difference. The horns amass, becoming discordant and strident. As they mix with cross rhythms, they move from an invocation of the sweet horns associated with 70s soul to the warring brass in Duke Ellington's 1940 recording of Harlem Air Shaft, all the way back to the beautiful cacophony of a New Orleans second line performance, or the collective music and dance of the buzzard lope, analyzed brilliantly by R.A. Judy. A whole history of racialized expression and its relationship to physical embodiment of musical performance and the brutal physicality of forced labor is encoded in this track. Indeed, the acoustics become flesh, recording different forms of embodiment in relationship to the long history of Black musical forms. Music is rendered flesh here, and a richly sentient and articulate flesh, as Judy posits it. The sexiness of the song and its enactment of gender is structured in part in relationship to this conception of flesh. Flesh here becomes a mediation between sex as a structured silence and gender, which is central to the performative dimensions of the song. You know what? I'm going to take off my jacket.
Take it off.
That's right. I know. All right. I figured it would end in a striptease or something.
The next t-shirt.
All right. As a non-binary artist invested in de-binarizing and rerouting gender, many of Toomer's songs enact a powerful gender queerness. Gospel for a New Century is no exception. The song is addressed to a girl, yet the more you listen to the song, it is increasingly unclear whether the girl in question is referring to the diminutivized addressee of your conventional pop song or Yves themselves. This ambiguity richly persists throughout the song, situating its desires in an indeterminate relationship between self and other, reflexiveness, and a reaching out towards otherness. This oscillation between self and other, in which neither yields a stable position, will be central to the account of desire in this book. This reflexiveness is also apparent in the repeated phrase, "This ain't by design, girl," suggesting that we are not fully in control of our subjectivities and our romantic entanglements. While we need designs for both individual and collective living, the socialist vision that this book articulates probably depends on the importance of design. We also need to recognize that design is always complicated by contingency, and that which eludes or complicates its rational workings, including drives, the unconscious, chance events, new social, economic, and ecological developments, new social actors, and that which remains excluded, also called the real in Lacanian terms, from the symbolic order our designs have produced. As I argue later in the book, we need a socialism and a conception of public sex that is both by design and that recognizes that designs are always incomplete. Design needs to be balanced with the workings of contingency, improvisation, split subjectivity, power from below, and the unpredictable. I call this socialism without mastery, grounded in a Marxism without mastery. It is a version of what Lauren Berlant calls the inconvenience of other people. but I want to call it the pleasure of other people. It is the serendipitous encounter with the otherness that startles, transforms, and pleases. We need a socialism that can account for this. While I advocate a socialism without mastery, our relationship to desire, of course, may be about fantasies of mastery. Any conception of public sex worthy of its name certainly would make room for fantasies of mastery, along with many other consensual fantasies and activities. But we should not confuse the fantasy of mastery as it plays out in kink with the drive towards mastery itself. Samuel R. Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue is another touchstone for any work that attempts to theorize public sex and what I describe in chapter 4 as a sexual commons. Delaney draws upon Jane Jacobs' critique of modernist planning to challenge the newly Disneyfied and neoliberal Times Square created around the turn of the 21st century and to defend the public sex cultures and cultures of interclass contact that occurred in the space before. While Jacobs' critique makes sense in this context, and in a moment when the arrogance of capitalist top-down planning destroyed functioning neighborhoods, our own moment is defined by uncontrolled capitalist speculation and wholesale destruction of urban space that in its name. Take contemporary San Francisco for one of its most dystopian instantiations, and the creation of what Mike Davis terms a planet of slums. From the contemporary vantage, social planning looks like a lost art, one that we need to renew. We need planning, but we also need play and improvisation. The best social visions and the best art, take jazz and other improvised music, for example, combine these two approaches. In what follows, the world we need is both by design and finally ain't by design, girl. There is always the disruption via otherness, including the otherness within. Otherness makes things complicated, but also sexy. Despite how Yves Tumor begins the song, I think I can solve it. I can be your all. We can never be anybody's all, either to ourselves or others. Instead, we need to strive towards solutions while recognizing the not all of anything we essay. It is to such a joyful, yet responsible and just future that this book is written. Sex, to my mind, needs to be part of such a just future. I once had a friend tell me that the problem with Californians like me, and I will note that I only lived there for 8 years in grad school.
But I'm from there.
Yeah, I know, and I'm from there in heart. I once had a friend tell me that the problem with Californians like me is that we confuse sex with revolution. I invite that confusion. This book is my attempt to stay true to it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris, for inviting me to be in conversation with you tonight. Thank you to the Bureau for generously hosting us, to Avhi and Anne for your time and generosity and being in conversation with us, for everyone who's here tonight on this night of all nights. Your interest, your support, your presence, it means so much. Thank you to our editor, Richard Morrison, who's here, for your support of this work and of us. If there was ever a time to mobilize the imagination to think the world otherwise, it is now. So I'm going to talk a bit about what my book, Black Kenosis, is about. I'll share a bit from the preface. I'll read directly from it. I'll talk about the shape of the book. And then afterwards, during the conversation, if people are interested to hear how I came to this work, because I really shared nothing in my bio, I'm happy to talk about that as well. Black kenosis considers the contradiction of the term Black kenosis, which, as I use it, is an act of self-emptying through sexual self-subjection in transgressive African-American literature of the post-civil rights era. Put simply, it's a book focused on and committed to literary analysis of Black writers representing transgressive sexuality amidst 20th century debates that Black writers and thinkers were having about what African-American literature is and what supposedly it should do. Kenosis, a term taken from Greek for Christ's act of humbling himself from God to man, is a concept taken up in theology, continental philosophy, and 20th century theory to describe a gesture of self-emptying. As I use it, kenosis is a breaking device, severing the predecessor or dominant paradigm, an undoing of the imagination. It's a movement toward discontinuity with the precursor through acts of dispossession or detachment. It's a questing for the fire of one's own stance. Historically, there has been great pressure on Black writers from both critical and commercial expectations alike to represent their race in realistic ways. And this is what Jean Jarrett terms racial representation. Racial representation became proxy for racial progress, a norm that presupposes the socio-critical function of African-American culture and also assumes that that function is best served by a type of realist aesthetics that casts racial Blackness in overridingly positive terms. By historical and political necessity, African-American literature has been tasked with a role in political action, to facilitate social change, and to endeavor to overthrow racial injustice. And countless readers and critics have long shared this expectation, often foreclosing recognition of other possible political or aesthetic commitments. There is little to no room, for instance, in this explanation of what African-American literature supposedly does or should do to attend to what Black queer studies professor Sharon Patricia Holland terms the erotic life of racism, and to other sexually charged asymmetrical power dynamics present in the work that can disorient the reader and the critic, like a rough undertow pulling us into the offing. I argue it is this common sense predecessor that canonic Black writers pervert, misrepresent, and undo, often through staged sex scenes that dramatize the conflict of self-subjection to asymmetrical power dynamics. The fictional misrepresentations of sexual self-subjection that I read depict intractable, contrary, and at times ambiguously self-determined submission to another, and exposure to an unthinkable or unspeakable state, condition, or experience. Sexual self-subjection, as I read it in texts by Samuel R. Delaney, Gail Jones, Toni Morrison, and Octavia Butler, among others, is a canonic aesthetic experiment, not without risk. The at times vicious eroticism and at times excruciatingly grotesque images saturating these works, proliferating both racist stereotypes and innumerable oppressions, are fantasy representations. And these fantasies include pederasty, incest, rape, murder, coprophagia, and necrophilia. These are but a handful of transgressions that are explored within these novels. As fantastic literary presentations of extreme sex at the edges, meaning what many people identify as a hard boundary, they reveal the problem of representation itself. I look to sex, specifically transgressive sex, that's difficult to accept as part of any character's psychology, because it's through these staged scenes that Black canonic writers are reflecting on the overused defaults to literalization and the allegorical that plague African-Americanist literary criticism. And I'm happy to share more during our conversation about how I argue that sex scenes staging and mediating desire circulation might be understood as the literary within the literary. And I could do that as a way of trying to explain, as I see it, the relationship between sex and the problem of representation. For 20th century African-American writers, representing sexual self-subjection meant breaking with Black art's governing paradigms, hence the term Black kenosis. By Black kenosis specifically, I mean the following. Through an act of self-emptying of the racialized cultural schema that subjectifies one against one's will, one can and does pervert the predecessor. The undoing of African-American literature, I argue, is the untying of that literary body to liberationist politics of resistance, and thereby a decoupling of African-American literary studies from an institutional appeal for recognition and legitimacy. Contemporary readers and critics of African-American literature accept and take for granted that the canon is undone. My book is one story of its undoing. I argue ultimately that Black kenosis is an epistemological procedure that eschews the hubris of liberation and resistance as they are dominantly framed. I create the metaphor of sexual self-subjection as a theory of African-American literature to challenge the regulatory ideals of the anti-racist liberatory movements of the 20th century, specifically 1960s through 1970s Black cultural nationalism that sought to stabilize an irrefutably resistant Black subject. Black cultural nationalism saw subjection, either self-determined or conscripted, as treacherous to this aim, the sign of counter-revolutionary backsliding or self-hatred. My intervention permits us to see how the erotic in African-American literature was and is both an object of repression and a catalyst for sexual and epistemological rebellion, where institutional regulations were and are concerned. And so now I'll share a bit about the overview of the project's shape, and I'll read a little from the preface. Samuel R. Delaney's work forms this book's conceptual spine, because his uncompromising fictional iterations of sexual self-subjection, which are incredibly varied in nuance, boldly model the canonic African-American literary experiment. But the preface and introduction actually begin with focused attention to two other canonic Black writers of what I call the wayward canon, and both of whom are ghosts in the machine of the project, Gary Fisher and Chester Himes, respectively. Here, I'm going to read a short excerpted passage from the preface, and I begin with a quote. I understand this self-slaughter, but it scares me. I'm trying to decreate, trying to go back, not to an easier time, but a more honest one. Shit, slave, N-word, cocksucker, like the wind and darkness, the auroras of autumn. I'm doing it with sex and society, bludgeoning myself with misconceptuous facts, or the fictive facts that were, in fact, bludgeons then. No, I'm doing it with words. Gary Fisher, Christmas Eve, 1985. Gary Fisher was a definitive Black canonic subject, and the Black canonic subject is the contradiction at the center of this project. Infamously, in his posthumous collection, Gary in Your Pocket, Fisher recounts his desire for and experiences of self-subjection to white sadomasochistic masters, and the humiliating racist debasement, what he calls a huge turn-on, that he courted and ensued as part of their staged sexual encounters, not unlike Delaney's libidinal knowledge-questing character, John Marr, in 1994's The Madman, which I discuss in the book's second chapter. If the common sense predecessor of racial representation is what canonic Black writers like Fisher and Delaney pervert, misrepresent, and undo, often through staged sex scenes that dramatize the conflict of self-subjection, then it is important to establish here that gestures fraught weight. Subjection, noun, in senses related to subject, adjective. That is under the rule or control of someone or something. In a state of subjection or dependence under the control, rule, or influence of something, subordinate. In predicative use, frequently with, to, till, unto. In a state of subjection to the power, law, command, etc. of another. Expressing a relationship of liability, exposure, or dependence between a person or thing and a state, condition, or experience. Exposed or open to, prone to, or liable to suffer from something damaging, deleterious, or disadvantageous, situated below something. Judith Butler explains subjection signifies the process of becoming subordinated by power, as well as the process of becoming a subject. Whether by interpolation in Althusser's sense or by discursive productivity in Foucault's, the subject is initiated through a primary submission to power.
In Scenes of Subjection, published the same year as Butler's The Psychic Life of Power, Saidia Hartman argues enslaved people, both before and after the double bind of emancipation, are exemplars of this paradox. She claims the recognition of the humanity of the slave did not redress the abuses of the institution. The acknowledgement of the slave as subject was a complement to the arrangements of chattel property. Emancipation, therefore, appears less the grand event of liberation than a point of transition between modes of servitude and racial subjection. Through her refusal to critically read and recirculate the primal scene of Aunt Hester's beating in Frederick Douglass's narrative, Hartman establishes the terrible power and importance of the event and the witnessing of it. Subjection gives birth to the slave. To be a slave is to be under the brutal power and authority of another. Elsewhere, I have drawn upon Hartman to explore what I term security through subjection, a phrase I use to consider the act of subjecting oneself to what is commonly understood as oppression for pragmatic reasons, including emotional security, a sense of power, and/or a perverse type of pleasure that temporarily mitigates an anxious relationship to precarious freedom. For 20th century African-American writers, representing sexual self-subjection meant breaking with Black art's governing paradigms. And breaking the barrier risked careers, as I discuss in my first chapter regarding Gail Jones. To represent Black characters who surrender to contradictory forces of desire, one's own and another's, sometimes evocative of the aesthetics and dynamics of chattel slavery, risks exposing them to a deleterious state condition or experience. As Derek Scott reminds us, the consolidation of the racial ego that liberationist Black politics calls a self requires rejecting what Hartman calls the injurious constitution of Blackness, and what Fanon refers to as the fact of Blackness, the primal, abject conditions that continuously blacken the object turned subject, including its subjection to various states of sexual violence and debasement. Shoring up the racial ego requires an outright rejection of what Hartman calls the dutiful submission characteristic of Black subjectivity and the abiding legacy of Black inferiority and subjection. Yet to affirm Blackness by historical necessity foregrounds the conditions of possibility for the blackened subject. What then to make of the decision to self-subject, to represent such threatening fantasies? The remainder of the book takes up that question by first looking at Chester Himes's 1954 novel, The End of a Primitive. In the introduction, a paradigmatic Black canonic text that realizes Himes' canonic desires by detaching from the demands of protest fiction, the demands to resist the racist fantasies of white supremacist and white liberal America, and instead self-subjecting to them. The introduction also establishes the importance of Delaney, the writer most important to this project who carries on this approach in his work. Delaney was writing what he explicitly refers to as transgressive fiction, beginning in the late 1960s, which many of his Black literary contemporaries were doing as well. Delaney is a legendary figure in literature and elsewhere who has shaped queer studies, for too long a whitewashed field, and Black sexuality studies, while rarely being acknowledged as an influence on African-American literature beyond Afrofuturism. His staged sex scenes are particularly stimulating in their reach. And from 1975 on, Delaney's work is explicitly sexual, and by his own admission, pornographically homosexual, which has historically made it difficult to include his fiction more broadly in the African-American literary canon. While Delaney does not publicly think of himself or claim that his sexually explicit work is radical, at least not in the conversations I've had with him as recently as a month ago, it's undeniable that irreverent Black writers of the wayward canon, such as Fisher, Himes, and Delaney, and his literary contemporaries whose work I read in Black Kenosis gave expression to alternative ways of living. Ways of living not dictated by racial unity, protest, social justice, or the afterlife of respectability politics. Ways of living that were seen as deleterious to these endeavors or ideologies, whether they were so in actuality or not. These writers understood art that is exhausted by the politics around, above, and beneath it tends to be transient and ultimately lifeless. Wildly disparate expressions of humanity precede representation. And to cite Delaney, to live is to be in flux between what has been defined as sane and what has been abjured as unspeakable. The normative ideologies attempting to contain African-American literature in the service of socio-political use value calcify and overshadow how we read, misread, or fail to read that literature. In effect, subordinating the psychic imaginative to the social political. But not all literary excess can be recuperated. I also discuss in the intro how Delaney's work from '69 onwards resonates with 1970s and 1980s Black feminist fictions and Black feminist criticism's amplification of eroticism, alternative sexualities and queerness, and contested discourses of pleasure, power, and desire, which are topics central to contemporary Black studies. Reading the work of Jones, Morrison, and Butler in tandem with Delaney, as each chapter of Black Kenosis is structured, amplifies how writers committed to literary critical rebellion produced and perceived the complicated entanglements of the erotic, the sexual, and the political in African-American literature. And in so doing, I account for how transgressive sexuality in the literature emerges in part as a result of reimagining and re-articulating politics and liberation, rather than merely opposing or outright rejecting. As I argue in the book's chapters, Black writers canonically experimenting with the race barrier that insisted on protest fiction, racial realism, and positive representations were striving to express a fuller and messier range of humanity. Kenosis is a gesture of transformation, but I do not understand it to be transcendent or exalted. I am not arguing for, as Kathy Cohen did, deviance as resistance toward material emancipation. Rather, I recognize in the following work a commitment to being, in Hymes's words, a fundamental writer, plumbing the fathoms of artistic erotic imagination, expressing forms of becoming nothing, dispossession, and annihilation, without concern for what is or is not appropriate or politically efficacious. In the book's chapters, I limn sexual self-subjection as an abiding problem, meaning what we often call a problematic conceptual preoccupation with its concerning and pleasurable qualities. In every chapter, I look at Delaney's work in relationship to texts written by contemporaneous Black women writers, so Jones, Morrison, and Butler. And I attend to their conceptually aligned visions of sexual self-subjection, often enacting what I read as edge play, which are forms of kinky play that push at the edges of safe, sane, consensual, and risk-aware consensual game, which are the tenets of BDSM. Chapter 1 attends to eroticized violence that causes serious permanent harm and or death in Delaney's '69 novel Hog and Gail Jones's '76 novel Eva's Man. Chapter 2 explores total power exchange, a BDSM power dynamic where the partners have agreed that the dominant has complete and total power over the submissive. In Delaney's '94 novel The Madman and Morrison's '74 novel Sula. Chapter 3 engages with coerced consent, or with what is known as consensual non-consent in the kink community. In Delaney's Madman and his '74 novel Dahlgren, and Butler's '84 short story Bloodchild. And I situate that analysis specifically in the context of contemporary interrogations of consent, including as conceptualized by contemporary Black feminist critics. The coda meets race play a form of edge play that uses role-playing scenes, tools, and props that stage and eroticize racial difference and histories of racialized exploitation uncomfortably head-on in the classroom and in the culture at large. Reading conceptually aligned texts together in each chapter emphasizes how these writers, despite their gender and genre differences, were articulating strikingly similar visions during a time where political activism often meant vehemently rejecting such images and ideas. Similar gestures of erotic undoing proliferate across these texts that we as critics have for too long generically, theoretically, and genealogically cordoned off from one another. By reading them with, across, and through each other, we see to what extent post-civil rights African-American literature is inherently complementarily wayward, full of imaginative visions that are disposed to go against the wishes or advice of others, or what is proper or reasonable, intractable, self-willed, and perverse. In closing, I want to say that I recognize the diversity of Black art in order to challenge continual suppression and containment. And by containment, I mean institutionalizing forces that intend to flatten the richness of Black cultural production. I create opportunities in my research and writing and teaching for myself and others to listen to the complex, diverse work of Black writers and to listen to what has always been present in that work, but which has nonetheless gone unrecognized or been underengaged, often for ideological reasons from both ends of the political spectrum. Thank you so much.
And now we're going to bring up Anne Pellegrini and Afki Sakatopoulou. Anne Pellegrini is professor of performance studies and social and cultural analysis and chair of the Department of Performance Studies at New York University. They are also a psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City. Their most recent book is Gender Without Identity, co-authored with Afki Sakatopoulou. Afki Sakatopoulou is a practicing psychoanalyst and a faculty member at the NYU postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. She is author of Sexuality Beyond Consent, Risk, Race, Traumatophilia, and co-author of Gender Without Identity. She is at work on a new book manuscript provisionally titled Sadism. Please welcome them both.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to get to be in conversation. You both, Chris and Kieran. And so the I guess is we're gonna chat with you for about 20 minutes. And this is so gendery. I'm basically gonna have a boy crush on Chris. So direct some comments and questions zero away. So, yeah, so it might get a bit tricky. Maybe there'll be some wayward comments that will go in multiple directions. But first, I just want to thank you for the actually for both the book and the book that I can't wait for to arrive actually. But I've just devoured In Defense of Sex, and I've also already been recommending it to my students today in office hours. And there's a particular line that just leapt out at me. And it sort of feels like it encapsulates everything you're trying to do in the book. And you say, yet we lose something when we do not theorize sex. Mm-hmm. And so, and you say this in numerous ways throughout the book, but I like the way that you're underscoring why the shift to gender has seemed so necessary, conceptually and politically. Mm-hmm. And that this was pushing against the particular ways in which, sex as an essentialized and biologized version of sex was being leveraged against queer people and trans people in particular. It's also been leveraged against, I guess we now use the language of cis women. Basically, it's been weaponized quite heavily. Absolutely. But, what you point out is that by moving away from the materiality of the body and into realms which sometimes took the version of being just discursive, which is itself too reductive of the complex ways of thinking about the body as socially constructed. things went missing. Including not just the sensuousness of bodily life, we lose the ways to think about how the complex interactions between sex and gender.
Mhm.
And so you're pushing against the sort of, a kind of replacement of a problematic opposition with just, we're just gonna choose one term. Right? And so I'd love to hear you maybe talk about that a little bit for, because this I think is super important. I mean, I love the way you're giving us a version of a non-binary sex, which is already not a kind of collection of terms we expect to hear together, right? Non-binary sex, you say it's non-binary material, it's not a passive substrate, it's not interchangeable with gender, nor its opposite. Gives us a spectrum of possible embodiments. It also gives us, and I think this is so important, gives us limit and capacity, but not limitless capacity. And so again, so we lose something when we do not theorize sex. So can you say a little bit more about that? It's so important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anne. That's just such a high compliment. I really value your reading of my book and of what I'm trying to do. And yeah, that's exactly right. I think that we do lose something when we stop thinking about sex, when we stop theorizing sex, when we stop seeing sex as something that structures us in ways that we aren't fully in control of, even as we also have to be responsible toward. But you know, and part of this is a kind of old kind of Marxist impatience with the idea that we could script our lives in ideas fully, that what we could do, and you know, discourse is much more complicated than you know, ideas of sort of voluntary you know, sort of idealizations. I mean, discourse is structured in precisely the ways that Foucault talks about and stuff like that. And but I think that there's a drive that we have, and we hear it in a lot of neoliberal culture, even though that's actually, you know, unwinding right now into something worse, it seems like. But you know, we're in at best late neoliberalism, which is more about like trying to gain enough human capital to maybe get a gig job, rather than like, you know, sort of becoming one of the leaders of society. Instead, it's about like, you know, how you put together the next month's rent or whatever. But and you know, we could talk about class, and that's very quick and glib. But part of what materialism has always meant to me, and I feel like I almost experienced this kind of physically, you know, in my returns to the hospital bed, is that matter actually sets limits on what can be inscribed, and you know, in relationship to it, and matter sets limits on what we can embody. Those limits aren't hard and fast. You know, they aren't negating of the kind of psychic complexity and beauty of gender and the ways in which we have gendered embodiments. You know, they don't, you know, they don't reinscribe traditionalist or conservative ideas or they don't have to reinscribe traditionalist or conservative ideas of binary embodiment. Actually, the body is much more complex than that. You know, Anne Fausto Sterling's work, her more recent work, rather than, I mean, the old work, it got critiqued for some good reasons, but, you know, although it was also groundbreaking, that was the book, reading that in grad school was the book that actually, all of a sudden I realized, oh my God, I am intersex. I had no idea I went through all this stuff, but I had no idea that this is what this was. It was a late realization for me. But you know, part of what she argues is that there's about 5 different components to sex in her book, Sex Gender, and they all shape us. And so the idea that these would all be binary, you know, even epigenetics have taught us that you know, genetics themselves aren't binary, that they actually necessarily depend on environmental factors to shape their expression. And so, you know, whether you're talking about gonadal sex, whether you're talking about you know, genital sex, whether you're talking about you know, DNA, you know, all you know, there's a couple others that hormonal sex, you know, embodied states as we grow and change, you know, and as the culture shapes our embodiment, you know, it doesn't just shape our ideas of gender, it shapes our embodiment. All of those, we can actually start to think of sex as a much broader continuum, one that you know, in statistical ways might seem to still gravitate towards ideas of male or female, but there's a whole large, you know, section in between, and that what we call male and female is a centering or a reduction of what is actually the complexity of sex expressions. You know, you know, think about how many people we refer to as women who can't reproduce, for example, or can't reproduce without, technology of various sorts. Think of people we think of as, as men who can. I mean, think of all of these ways in which our bodies are much more complex, than the binary categories we impose on them. And so that was really important to me. The other thing that also I really wanted to be critical of, and in a supportive way, in a loving way, because I love my queer friends, I love my queer community, and I wouldn't be anywhere without it. But the ways in which we've taken up ideas of micro identity, the ways in which definition seems to have taken the place of desire in a certain way. Even how we talk about desire, is more about like, I'm into this, I'm not into that. I'm you can define me as a sapiosexual with, these, and you get, long strings of adjectives, but what about like desire isn't actually quite about that. It's about what strikes you in the moment. It's about a transaction with somebody else. It's about a transaction with your own body that you're not fully aware of. It's something that actually isn't that controllable or scriptable. And so for me, one of the things that I think it's great that we found enriched vocabularies to talk about all this stuff, but I think we've lost the sense of otherness and connection to otherness that sex is about on a certain level, including the otherness inside ourselves.
Gonna pick up on one more thing, that having to do with this issue of micro identity that you're talking about. And I would love to maybe talk some more about how it connects to neoliberalism.
Yeah,
Because I was really struck by how central neoliberalism is as a character.
it's a little too much in some ways. I was frustrated with that in some ways. Yeah.
Well, yes and no, because you're also, I think this is also where one is struggling for vocabulary.
Right. Right.
What moment are we in? I think we
Right.
are, and I think it's generally agreed we're in a moment of transformation.
Right.
But what do we call it? Do we call it late neoliberalism? Do we call it techno-feudalism?
Right.
Do we call it late fascism? Right. And so, but you also say, and I think this is actually important, we are, something is changing, and it actually has changed. And
Yeah.
there are those who argue that in fact, that the first Trump, I can't believe I'm having to say this, the first Trump presidency of 2016, in some sense, was the end of neoliberalism.
Right.
And maybe it started with the 2008, sort of basically
Right. The
crash,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because that showed just how hollow neoliberal promises were.
Absolutely.
Now, and Trump's solution, so we're not gonna have neoliberalism, we're gonna have, well, we don't particularly like what he's proposing.
Right.
But it's so what is this moment? And yet you say that the logic of neoliberalism nonetheless is still quite active, and it's especially active in the ways in which we are still asked to be entrepreneurs of ourselves, investing in our human capital, and then gender. And I think this was really significant. Gender as human capital.
Yeah, and I feel like it's become that in some ways, right? Yeah, and oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think this is also one of the reasons why you're wanting us to think with sex and its multiplicity and materiality as a way to push against that particular kind of commodification and capture of gender by neoliberalism.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's exactly what I see, and I also see. I mean, there's great utopian potential to gender and its complexity too. I don't want to lose that, but part of what I've seen in the shift, even from the '90s to the present, and as somebody who was learning queer theory and in the '90s and being energized by it, there was a kind of collective address that queerness once had. It was an address to try and organize collectively, to try and produce a kind of.
I disagree.
Okay, good. We should get into that. No, I mean, this is why I wanted us to talk together, right?
Spike's yelling at it.
Right, exactly, right. And I mean, no, this is, I mean, our stuff is both so in dialogue
I know.
and also it's such beautiful tension. So no, this is what I love about your work. So let's, we'll get into that. But good, this is getting exciting. Right. Right, exactly. But it was for me, there was an idea of okay, this is all the forms of sexuality and embodiment that resist the norm, that actively resist the norm, that are trying to challenge the norm. And it was a political category that was supposed to be collective on a certain level. It's now been replaced by the endless acronym, right? Queerness has become LGBTQIA, and you can just keep going because they keep adding, and all of that is I'm not trying to mock, I'm not trying to at all. All of that is important, but I worry that it actually has lost the vision that we actually can become something different, that we can become collective on a certain level, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
So I'm gonna make my argument before the Supreme Court and say I reserve my final few minutes. I'm gonna hand this.
But first of all, let me thank the Bureau for hosting this event. I'm always very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be in your company. Thank you all for being here tonight. I am so excited about both of these books. But I'm gonna tie myself to the mast and stay focused on thinking about kenosis with you, since kind of like we divided the conversation this way. And I want to start by saying,
So binary.
that one of the things that I find that connects the two projects, like that both of you are trying to create a certain space for complexity that pushes back against the way in which movements that were working towards liberation have actually architected their own flatness.
Yeah.
And kind of like you're both working towards expanding that space, and even taking risks going into territories that are not always welcome to be explored and that require a certain kind of like they usually come with an expectation that one will prove their intentions before one is allowed to venture into that territory. So I want to like think with you and ask you a couple of things. I want to like go back to the way that you define kenosis, which I think is so interesting, especially for me as a psychoanalyst, thinking like the way that you talk about kenosis as an act of self-emptying of the racialized cultural schema that subjectifies against one's will, a decoupling from appeal to recognition. And I can't say enough about how much I appreciate this decoupling from recognition and the ways in which we have been really been captured, if not constrained, by the logics of recognition that that demand certain kinds of subjects and certain kinds of legibility, certain kinds of legitimacies. And the way that you insist on kenosis as not landing on a sociopolitical use value, I think that that's really interesting. So I wanted to kind of like, starting with this, to ask you a couple of questions. I'm thinking there's a moment in your preface, I think, and also later in the book, which I can't wait to read. The first few chapters are amazing. This is really exciting work, having had the privilege of a preview. It's really interesting. And you talk about how erotic charge burns brighter at the disruption and distortion of the labor of positive racial representation. And I was wondering if you can say something to us about like what is the connection you're making between erotic heat and the disruption of the representation, of the representational schema. I mean, you're specifically speaking about race, but there's also a way in which you're asking us, kind of like both of you are asking us to imagine, but you specifically are thinking about the imaginative project that some African American literature that has not made it into the canon argues for. But why the heat? Kind of like why the sexual at the disruption of representation? So I can ask a couple of questions and give you some moments to think, or if you kind of like want to just take this, whatever you prefer.
Ravi. Yeah, it has something to do with God, the word is escaping me. I feel so branded today. I'm sure a lot of us do.
Nothing going on.
Yeah, the word is escaping me, but it's something about that which is not expected, right? It's a flying in the face of expectation, defying that, right? And defying what is recognizable and expected and dictated and constrained and controlled and contained. And, it's allowing oneself to go to that place racially through sex, right? That is where, to me, as I read it, and it's really grounded for me in Gary Fisher, who I see right there. Where he says, I'm trying to decreate, right? And it scares me, this self-slaughter. And that's also where the heat is for him, to intentionally go against
not only what's externally expected, right, of one's racialized positionality, but internalized. Or one's queerness, or what, you know, all the ways that we're expected to show up and identify and perform and be legible as racialized, sexualized subjects. To absolutely go against that in one's own kinky practice and in one's literary practice. Sometimes those two are intertwined, as they are for someone like Fisher and someone like Delane. And someone like Octavia Butler and Gail Jones, certainly. Yeah, to intentionally go against that. So powerful.
You know, it makes me think of something you were just talking to us about kind of like how like the kenotic experience is not so much about resistance as it is about dispossession. And dispossession is a very complicated term with which like we can go in a variety of different directions. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit about dispossession, the dispossession of the subject from the self, from the ego, kind of like the self-emptying. And what does it mean to put a series of authors who are thinking about dispossession together, not to create a collective? I wonder if that goes back to your back and forth, like that there is a kind of, I don't know if this is a term that would speak to you, a kind of self-sovereignty that comes with dispossession, which is not the self-sovereignty that can get kind of like fully lost or absorbed in the collective. There's still like an individuality that that we have become so frightened of because it has usually been leveraged against social power, against kind of like cultural forces. There's something here about like the singularity of the being as opposed to the collective. And I was really interested to hear more about that.
Thank you so much for making that connection. And it actually is making me think about something in response to the first question you asked. Part of the heat of that erotic charge is the fear. And the fear comes from risking being a part of the collective. That being in solidarity, public solidarity with certain politics, one might even say towing the line of certain politics, provides a type of safety, a type of comfort, a type of legibility, a type of acceptance, a type of community, as fraught as that word is. And to risk going against that, not only in one's sexual practices, you know, because this book is like a combination of people's, you know, autobiographical writing, as well as, you know, memoiristic writing, as well as fiction. And so to go against the collective through one's risky, racialized, sexualized, intertwined racialized, sexualized choices is frightening, terrifying, and that is also where there is an erotic charge. And to go against the dictates of African-American literature as a collective endeavor, right? Toward resistance, toward liberation, toward positive racial representation in the service of the struggle is truly a terrifying gesture. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, but you finish.
No, go ahead, because then I want to talk about our work in relation to the collective and the.
Yeah, and I actually want to pick up on that. And I mean, in part, obviously, our work is pushing in different directions, and I think richly and productively so. I mean, that's actually what I love when you know, when you juxtapose work, and that's what I want from my, you know, I mean, Karen's one of my favorite intellectual interlocutors, and so I mean. And that's what you want from an interlocutor. You don't want a mirroring, right? You don't want, again, this is what I'm talking about. You want to open up to otherness. You want to open up to an encounter with other thoughts, other modes of being and thinking. You want those challenges, but I think but I also think that there's an overlap here. And I think it speaks a lot that we have two psychoanalysts who are responding to our work, because it's about the limits of ideas of the conscious, of the scripted, and of ideas of representation as pedagogy. right? Rather than representation as fantasy, for example,
Mhm.
right? Which this is in my other work rather than this book, but like, my investment in things like noir, and in, the work done by like hard-boiled novels, the complicated fraught work done by hard-boiled novels way back in the day, and by like, negative, postmodern texts like Dodie Bellamy's work or Leslie Marmon Silko's work, is that they actually stage fantasies that refuse ideas of respectability, refuse ideas of that literature is supposed to be pedagogical, that's supposed to give you the best self. To me, again, that comes back to our narratives of neoliberalism, right? This is going to go in a slightly different direction, but there's a amazing character in Natsuo Carino's book. It's not out. It's I can't think of it. Shoot. Anyway, it's a book where she's writing about a sex worker who starts. She's actually a private school student. She starts as a sex worker. She starts working as a sex worker. She starts out at the top of it. And then she goes all the way down to the sort of very bottom, and she's like, fucking on the top of a building strewn with garbage and stuff like that. And the whole time she's writing a diary that's still filled with like uplift. It's still filled with like positivity. And that to me is like, it's such a brilliant condemnation of the sort of neoliberal ethos. Like, as long as we just think positively, right? That everything's going to be okay. All we need is positive representation. Well, we can have all the positive representation we want. And, Trump's still in power.
Yeah, no shit.
Yeah.
I actually took notes about this that I want to refer to on my phone. This is related to your question about the individual and the collective. And I took notes about this because I want to think about how our work, one point where our work connects but diverges. And to
Really quickly, the book is grotesque. It took me a minute.
what I'm thinking about has to do with the way that we're both working with sex in relation to utopia and in relation to queer culture building or queer culture making world building. So you have this quote on page 22 where you say, "The vision that this book hopes to articulate is one in which ideas of gender, sexuality, and sex can function as part of a larger socialist, queer, feminist, and anti-racist transformation of culture and society, in which a new public culture can emerge that enables all to have a sustaining, consensual, and pleasurable relationship to embodiment, sex, and sexuality. To achieve this end, we need to rethink the way in which the concept of identity has functioned." And I really appreciate how much your book, especially chapter 4, works with Samuel Delaney's 3 theses in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. His first thesis being cultural institutions and infrastructure that support, queer relation are constantly embattled due to the class war raging all the time. His second thesis is that we need to constantly rebuild, regroup, right? Remake these institutions to support these relations. And his third thesis is that we have to constantly interrogate and critique those new institutions that we create. And so I feel like you're really taking him up on his call to action. And here's where I have to refer to my notes to help my addled brain. I say my project's different in that it argues that fantasy representations of transgressive sex undo or empty out the instrumentalizing of African-American literature as a collective endeavor in the service of positive racial representation. And so for me, sex is not utopia or social liberation, even though it is for Delaney, which is interesting. For me, sexual self-subjection is a direct challenge to that, to the default allegorical or literalist interpretations of the radically transformative power of African-American literature to materially challenge and dismantle an anti-Black racist regime. And so one more thing I'm gonna say is, for me, sex actually poses a contradiction and a problem that can't easily be transformed into something with socio-political use value. It does not, for me, provide a useful solution for a more just future. Rather, for me, it testifies to the uncontrollable capaciousness of the human imagination that cannot be tethered to any political agenda. And that to me is actually really powerful. And that's also where the erotic charge comes from.
And I think you know, thinking, you know, knowing we're having this conversation today of all days.
Exactly.
I mean, on the one hand, you know, that's, you know, that last chapter with that, you dare to do something, which is offer a program. And, you know, that is imagining a sexual and bodily commons. And so my one response I had to it was like, oh my God, I want to go to there. And then another response was, but that's not the sexual. Like, you know, here I'm thinking, you know, with Laplanche, that infantile sexual or the sexual is actually that which disrupts all the binding
Yeah,
Right.
of the kinds of collective formations you're talking about.
right, right.
So I mean, and we don't know what will come in the wake of that unbinding.
Yeah.
It could be horrible, it
Yeah.
could be wonderful, it could be, you know, now we go to brunch.
Yeah.
Right? And so I was thinking, you know, where we see the infantile sexual and actually the threat of that heat, the
Yeah.
excitement of that heat is in an embodied libidinal collective called Trump, called MAGA.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
You know, called the Proud Boys.
Yeah.
Right.
So that, you know, the kinds of unleashing and unbinding has, you know, is absolutely, we don't know what what politics it might produce.
Absolutely.
So I felt like this is where I also, you know, I felt like there was this really interesting tension and, you know, I've also, you know, obviously be very inspired by Avi's work and thinking about, you know, just that we maybe sometimes put too much stock in the radical political potential of sex. This is not a, you know, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't take seriously what a kind of exposure to a limit experience can actually do. But it's not the politics that we then maybe think we're gonna like go out and, you know, get signatures for.
Right? I'm gonna say something really quick in relation to that, which is like, I found myself thinking, while you were speaking, Karen, about, Melina Williams and, Mike Bond. So these are kind of like two kind of like very established race players who are doing a lot of activism. And if you ask Melina Williams, which people have in print, like, do you care if your white top is a racist? She has a sense that there's some way in which racism can be not like the racism of the top cannot be exactly controlled, but that it can exist within kind of like a limited scope, so that yes, of course, all white people are racist, but there's a limit. You ask Mike Bond, which I have in an interview, he said, I said to him, do you care if your white kind of like female top is a racist? He said to me, absolutely not. So you see already kind of like within this collective of race players, you have already kind of like the individuality and the singularity of each subject. But I'm also thinking of this moment where Melina Williams says, to go to Anne's point, that there's no way of telling if at the time that your consensual top is kind of like in the midst of the heat of that moment, where other kinds of forces take over, forces that cannot be anticipated or consented to ahead of time. There's no way to know if at that moment you will feel hated or enraged or hateful. That kind of like what gets set in motion in moments like this is entirely outside of one's control. And in that sense, it's like such a radical project in the sense that it is not a project, like there's no controlling it.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like this difference between you is entirely fascinating to me.
I agree too. And the one thing I would say is that I actually think creating spaces in which you can explore that work and that work can happen and be supported is actually what I'm arguing for, rather than that the work will necessarily lead to affirmative ends. That sex as a mode of knowledge and as a mode of social knowledge feels really important to me, and it feels like something that we actually don't stage. I mean, we do in various places, but it's often in furtive ways, in ways that are marginalized, in ways that yeah, there's also the fear that you would remove the excitement of the danger too. I mean, there's a pleasure in there's a pleasure to the danger of doing something transgressive or doing something you don't know what the result is going to be. But when I wrote this book, I wanted it to, there's a lot of psychoanalytic writing, and I love psychoanalysis, and both Laplanche and Lacan and Freud, for that matter, are really central to my intellectual formation. But I wanted to write a book that was actually about sex as something that could be positive too. So much of psychoanalysis is always about sex as the negative, not necessarily as like negative in a bad sense, but it's always as the negation of anything you can control, anything you can script in terms of very much what's at the heart of what you're arguing. And I want to think about, I guess there's a kind of ghost of Marcuse that's, inhabiting this book on a certain level, and that I want to be able to think about, sex is also the building block of the social law in a certain way. We only do things because we desire to do them. We only, to me, sex is about those kinds of desire. It's about writing, it's about building, as well as tearing down, as well as fucking things up, as well as, playing in ways that sometimes are really risky. My own sex life is not so affirmative, but, so I mean, this is, I totally embrace the idea of the negative here, but I also think another issue that queer theory sort of reached a kind of dead end with or a certain kind of blockage with was the idea of just articulating a negativity without a kind of turn back towards, the critique of the normative was so important and remains so important. But there's also a way in which queer theory recently has tried to also articulate what are queer norms, because to build a social, you actually need a version of a social, you need some version of the norm, even as you also are always subverting it, always critiquing it. The negative work you're talking about, I think, is crucial to always maintain, because otherwise what you get is just, something that feels happy and completely mild and uninteresting, so yeah.
I just want to thank you, Avi, for bringing the name of Molina Williams into the room, because I would be nowhere without the work of kinky Black women. I mean, they have paved the way and opened the door for my work. And I knew if I was going to write about sexual self-subjection, and if I was going to be writing about submission, racialized submission, I had to go to an archive and learn from Black kinky women in their own words what that practice means for them. And so I was fortunate to do that work as the visiting scholar at the Leather Archives and Museum, where I was the visiting scholar from 2017 to 2018, spending time with Viola Johnson, Mama Vi's archive, and Michelle Buchanan's archive. And both Mama Vi and Michelle Buchanan are legendary submissives. Michelle referred to herself as a submissive, not a slave. Mama Vi referred to herself as a lifestyle slave. Their words, right? And it was doing deep work in those archives and reading Mama Vi's own thinking and published writing in Black Leather in Color, which was the first zine by Black kinky people for Black kinky people that Michelle Buchanan was the editor of. It was reading Mama Vi's thinking in that periodical about the limits her own community, right? Kinky community of practitioners of color were placing on her fantasies and her practice of race play. That really inspired my book. Yeah, and so my book comes from the work I did in the Leather archives of these Black kinky women. And so thank you for mentioning Molina Williams, who goes by many names, but one of them is the trembling flower of submission, right? She's in the lineage of women like Mama Vi and Michelle Buchanan. So thank you for that.
So, should we open it to the audience?
That sounds good.
Questions?
Oops.
This was very fun.
Yeah.
Yes,
We
absolutely.
can
Thank
keep
you so much.
monopolizing the conversation, but we
Thank
want
you.
to share. One of the rules of the comments.
Do I need to bring the mic, or can you just stand up and, would it help with the mic?
Mike always helps, especially because we're recording.
Totally. Oh, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Oops. Oh, we've run,
Dalia.
runner's been silent.
Dalia has a question.
Here you go, Dalia. Okay.
Thanks for your talk and for your work. I didn't want to speak first because I have sort of unformed question about negotiation as it plays in both of your work. And I really thought about it when I was thinking about your book, and kind of that negotiation between material and this sort of more
discursive.
theoretical abstract.
Yeah.
Approach. And I really appreciated that as the kind of work of the book, or it sounds like.
Yeah.
Book is to think about actually that negotiation itself.
Mhm.
I guess without having been able to finish that thought, I wonder if you have kind of like response to that, but I think maybe a more grounded question I ask, is about Karen, about readership. And I wonder if in your book, if you're thinking about audience responses to this, citations of these, those feel like kind of places to think about sociality and maybe not collective, something more explosive than that. But I'm curious if you as part of your research.
Think so.
The idea of negotiation, and especially the movement between the material and the abstract, or the material and the, alter material is sometimes what I call it, modes of representation or writing, or, which is still material. It's just it has a different material consistency. That's been central to my work in this book especially, but also in insistence of the material, and really the insight. And sometimes I worry I'm just rewriting this insight a decent amount of the time, but one always feels that way. Yeah, right, exactly, right. But one of the insights that really sort of inspired this work for me was the ways in which my own body, without my own control of it at all, kept resisting the kind of gendering that was being imposed on it, that it kept resisting that on the level of scar tissue, that it kept resisting that on the level of like my embodiment is basically, it's a little like my urethra is even further down than it was when I was born, because they screwed it up so much that it needs to be really far down, which is fine. I mean, it actually works, vaguely as birth control, and I have to sit down to pee, but most of the population does. So, but it otherwise, there's no real reason, there's nothing that different from it, but my body kept refusing the discursive scripts that were imposed on it. And it was really when I was reading Butler, really like years ago. I remember I talked about this in the afterward, where I was like, long hair grad student. I have no hair, but I was a long hair grad student, and at 24, taking this Greyhound bus trip to my friend Valerie's house down in LA, and reading all of Gender Trouble, and having this amazing kind of moment of like, wow, we do not have to, binary gender is not something that's natural. It's not something that's primary. It's actually this elaborate construction of culture, and that was so mind-opening for somebody who had had all this stuff done to them without even having a name for it yet. But then also to feel how non-material Butler was, at least in that early instantiation. And it's probably not fair to them. Their work is I love the readings of Merleau-Ponty, for example, and some of their essays and stuff like that. So, this was the reaction that a lot of people had. What about the body, Judy? And that whole and it's probably not fair to them, but I also, one of the things I loved about Butler and their work was that they pushed me to all of a sudden have this kind of moment, like, oh wow, the material can be agental. And this is why I still find new materialism really helpful to think about, that matter also resists, and not just resists, it produces, and so that's
Very
also really,
Cronenberg of you.
super Cronenberg. I love Cronenberg. Anyway, let me pass it over to you. Yeah.
Dahlia, what is your question about readership or audience? Because certainly my entire book is, every chapter is in response to the dominant ways that the texts I'm looking at have been framed by the critics. So I'm always citing the critics. How did Black feminist critics read Gail Jones's Eva's Man? Not well, right? Like not receptive. Yeah, that is a work that has been recovered into the canon recently, right? By contemporary Black feminist critics. But yeah, in its day, when it came out, it was essentially, Jones was essentially accused of being a traitor, being a race traitor. So much so that she asked Beacon Press to pull Corregidora and Eva's Man. And they refused, thankfully, because now we all get to enjoy those incredible texts, right? But yeah, every chapter is deeply
engaged with the critical reception of the work in its time.
What about the not critical reception, I guess is what I'm asking, like.
The contemporary reader.
Well, they were published, these are texts that are published. They had readership in our time, they have more and more, like, playing somebody, and you have like endlessly growing readership.
Oh, it's complicated though with Delaney, you know, I mean, like. I pitched this book a long time ago to another press who will go nameless, and they said, we love Delaney, but not that. Right? Yeah, like. I cite a lot from the Goodreads reviews of Hog in that chapter. They're like, this is the worst book I've ever read. This is the best book I've ever read. I mean, yeah, people
So
just don't know
bad I
what to
could
make.
stop reading it.
Yeah, like I read it in one night. Yeah, people just don't know what to make of it, and that's like contemporary readers posting their responses, I feel like I'm not answering your question.
No, I think that is the answer to the question,
Oh.
because like, in the comment that you talk about, that's like, this is the best novel ever.
The worst, the best.
Both of those I find suspicious.
Oh, for sure.
Right, like the best novel, like what does that mean? That, so maybe even, I think you're answering my question, I'm thinking about like, even sort of positive or affirmative or like, identificatory kind of readings are complicated.
Yeah, they're so vague. It's like,
And
what,
correct-
yeah, projections, what are you saying? Yeah. The coda, I talk about, teaching some of this work in the classroom. That's where we get into the contemporary readership. I talk about seeing slave play and people leaving in droves, I mean, that's the contemporary readership. Right? Yeah, I mean, he writes so much about slave play. Yeah, that's where I really take it into the present moment. I talk about, yeah, it's in the coda, I think. Yeah, thanks for that.
Other questions?
This is just kind of more of a.
Hi, Ron. Do you want a mic? Okay.
Okay.
This is more just a comment, to Christopher.
Sure.
About what you were explaining earlier about like, talking about desire.
Yeah.
Like, you're talking about like labels and stuff, but just talking about like queerness from a.
Yeah.
Frame of mind of like, coming back to desire,
Mm-hmm.
and I just like really love that comment.
Oh, thanks.
Because I like personally, I feel like talking about like queerness and like the feeling of like liberation and love, is something that's like sometimes hard to explain to people that don't identify as queer as like something that's really important.
Yeah.
To my own experience of queerness.
Yeah.
And whatnot, especially to friends I have that are like straight or not queer,
Right.
of saying like, this isn't like just about sexuality or gender or sex. It's
Mhm.
not like, these are my words and that's what ties me to queerness.
Right. Right.
But way more than that, it's about like a feeling of liberation and just like love. And I feel like that's something that to some of my like non-queer friends,
Mm-hmm.
something that they can't always relate to.
Mm-hmm.
And like their sexuality and sex and gender is simply just like, oh, this is like each of my words I use for this. But how I feel with my boyfriend, my girlfriend, or whatever relationship I'm in is like not necessarily defined by how happy I am, or about a feeling of community with other straight people,
Mm-hmm.
more than like a feeling of relation, or I don't know, but I just feel like that is like something really important to defining queerness for
Mhm.
me.
Ah, thank you. Yeah, I think desire is crucial for thinking about queerness and about sex, more generally. I mean, for a while, I think probably in the 90s, and I'm old, desire almost became like, that was the only way we were thinking about it at certain moments, you know, that was like the sort of the primary term. But I actually think at the same time, that it feels like, I mean, this is how I start the first chapter, or the introduction. I say, you know, we're living in a weird moment where sex is both everywhere, which is part of the asexual critique, which I totally get, but and yet everywhere a problem. Like, we don't seem to see sex as affirmative, as like, you know, as producing a kind of love or a desire or a sense of connection that is beyond just the personal, right? You know, that there's a fear that it's messy. It's going to mess up your human capital. It's going to mess up your sense of you know, well-organized self. It's going to, you know, mess up your gender identity at a certain level. And this is actually what I think ties back in with Avki's work, where one of the things I love one of the many things I love in Sexuality Beyond Consent is the way in which you talk about that it's actually the ego that is where racism and sexism and homophobia and class ugliness is reproduced. It actually, when you get to desire and the workings of the unconscious, that's actually much more of an opening out and an opening up. And that's also where I see, you know, again, despite our spiky differences, you know, which are great, you know, one of the things I see in both of our work is, you know, a respect for the unruliness and the unconscious dimensions of desire and of the workings of desire. I mean, the other thing I talk about in the book a bit, and I've talked about it elsewhere, is that all that medical work, of course, gave me my sexuality, and that sexuality is not my fantasy life is super dark, because that's what produced it, and it took me many years to actually find a relationship to that didn't feel guilt-ridden, among other things. And so yeah, I actually think that desire does really interesting work, and we need to give it more free rein.
But Ra, I'm also thinking, Ra was a student in my favorite class, Sex in Public in Chicago, which is a class about how publics, what are publics, and how publics discipline and make possible our sexuality. And it's focused on the history of LGBTQ plus people in the United States, primarily from 1967 or so on, or the 50s onwards. And I'm thinking about the final project that you made, which, do you remember? You made a beautiful dragon.
Yeah, I do remember.
Yeah, you made a beautiful, beautiful dragon and took it to the park with your friends and took photos of that. And that to me was an incredible expression of desire and love as you're describing it right now, and what desire means to you in your queer community, right? That's immediately what I thought of when you asked Chris this question. And so keep building those queer worlds, right? That really stretch how we think about things like desire or queerness. Yours was a vision of otherwiseness, things that are possible, right? And it was very beautiful. So thank you.
See, there's a political dimension to what you're doing.
Just otherwise.
Any other questions? Yeah.
We did around brat thing, the Collins Dictionary word of the year this year.
Brat?
Brat.
Yeah.
Like the real pop culture in terms of like the transfer that I chat with everyone. Is there any connection do you think between what you're talking about? Both nations and the sort of shift to these terms?
You know, I love the whole chaperone phenomenon. If that's it, you're talking about Brad, is that what you're saying?
And yeah, it was Charlie Xavier Feldman, but then it got put into the Collins Dictionary as the word of the year.
Oh, okay.
Saying that like a messy eligibility,
Mhm.
you sort of talked about, but it's actually becoming like popular. I just wanted to think of that.
I mean,
I have something to say.
I was just gonna say, like, there's nothing that is unpredictable and newly constituted as, whether you're gonna say resistance or through dispossession, that is not going to be immediately
yeah.
captured and turned into product, into identity, into neoliberal kind of like sellable merch object. So kind of like part, I think, of what I really appreciate about kind of like the kinds of things that you're writing about is this constant movement that is implied in these kinds of processes, that there is no final destination, that once you arrive, you're there and you're radical, or you arrive there and you're queer, or you arrive there and you're dispossessed. Like, this is a constant project of decreation.
Yes.
And a constant project of being at the edge of yourself, which is what makes it risky and exciting and hot.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
This is something that I think maybe Karen and Chris, you or all four of you might be able to respond to, but there's a contemporarily at least a large number of Black Kinksters who are moving into the pup play at furry communities. That's the communities that I've been a part of for about a decade now. And there's something interesting in perhaps considering what does giving up humanness, right, say about pressures for Black representation in kink spaces, but maybe also in literature, and then this notion of like denying the human corporeal body in at least in like a sexual space, right? Maybe denying that material quality of the self, but also having to be so deeply engaged, right, with using materials, consumptive materials, right, to do this. I was out with some of my colleagues last night trying to not watch CNN, and I was, an orange deer, right, like in that social space, not human, but present outside of my body. So I'd love to hear your response to animal role play.
Thank you so much for that question. I feel like you can respond to that question better than I can. That's something I would have to think about before I answer with any type of responsibility. But I'm gonna think about that question because it's really important. And I also want to think about that question in relation to contemporary Black studies that's trying to think otherwise about the human, right, with capital H. So thank you for that.
Actually, one of the places I end, and this is really a not fully developed gesture, and I've worked with post-humanist discourse more in like the book before this one, Existence of the Material, but one of the things I end with is not just Marx's idea of species being, and Judy's rearticulation of the flesh is similar in the sense that, I mean, in very different circumstances, but a sense of embodied sensuality, that comes from, the violent production of flesh, but an embodied sensuality that opens out to ecosystems, that opens out to collectivity, that opens out to animals, among other things, and Marx's idea of species beings that then gets reified slowly and then quickly out by wage labor and the reification of the body under wage labor, that gets reified out of human relationship to the landscape. And I argue that what we really need is not just a new idea of species being, but a trans species being, thinking about how we relate to animals and to the ecosystem and to plants in ways that, there's a version of posthumanism that I think erases those lines, that I think is fraught. But I also think that there's a way in which a certain reification of the body and of thought, that's an inheritance, not just of the Enlightenment, but of cultures of labor, have really separated us out from the ecosystemic, right? The commodity form and the fetishization I mean, Beverly Best writes really well about this right now. The fetishes, the way in which the law of value actually covers over and produces a kind of second nature over ecosystems in various ways, so that we don't pay any attention to them. We need to rethink that, and we need to redo that. And one utopian possibility of sex is that it's finally a new sensuality. I mean, this is where like the people like Annie Sprinkle are doing that. Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, the kind of ecosexual movement. Yeah. So
I was about to say Annie Sprinkle's ecosexual.
Yeah.
Thinking. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Want any more questions? I think we're almost at time.
Yeah.
Time to buy books.
Yeah.
And to
have some
Yeah.
snacks.
Yes.
Yes.
And to come up and tell us everything we got wrong.
Yeah.
Hey,
Nice.
awesome. That's awesome.
Nice. Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for
Thank
coming.
you all so much. Thank you.
And thank you all for hosting us. This is such
Oh
a
my gosh,
wonderful
thank you.
space. It's absolutely invigorating.
It is.